find it amusing when I sometimes hear people saying or implying that socialism is somehow a foreign doctrine to the United States of America or anti-American in some form, because really the American Revolution and the ideals of the revolution were one of the currents that fed into the development of socialism in the 1800s. How so? Well, as I've stated in previous programs, ideals like self-government, human equality, citizens' rights, personal freedom, people began to see that these could be extended from the political realm into the economic realm. And early on, Thomas Paine started to do this right after the American Revolution, talking about a more equal economy. You could see this even more so in France with the French Revolution, which followed just on the heels of the success of the American Revolution and inspired people to take up arms against the king. Some of the revolutionaries wanted to push beyond the political sphere into the economic sphere and make sure there is rights and freedom and self-government in the economic order. So one of the currents feeding into the development of socialism was this sense of human rights that came out of the Republican tradition. And I'm not referring to the Republican Party here. I'm referring to what republicanism meant early on, which was getting rid of kings and aristocrats and replacing it with rule by the people, rule accountable to the people through representative government. The other two currents that fit into this were, number one, intellectuals observing the development of early capitalism and both the value of that and the problems with it, and the workers' movement of working people trying to protect themselves and improve their situation under the new capitalist order. The intellectuals were people like Robert Owen, who was a Welsh businessman, and he saw, like others did in France, for example, that capitalism was helping to create new wealth and more productivity by bringing people together in an organized form to work, rather than having people do individualized labor, as in running a farm or working as an independent craftsman, bringing them together in one place. This is what they meant by socialization, that work was becoming socialized, it was becoming organized. They were called Utopian Socialists later on by Marx and Engels, because they thought these early socialists didn't really have a realistic idea of how to go about making change in our society, in our societies of the time. What the utopians wanted to do, I shouldn't use the word utopian because they wouldn't use it for themselves, it's kind of pejorative, but they would create grand plans for how to reorganize society, and they would try to find wealthy or powerful benefactors to institute them. What they actually found was that the only ones who had an interest in changing the way things were developing were the working people themselves. So they developed the following among working people, and in fact, Robert Owen, who I just mentioned, was an inspiration for the workers' and consumers' co-op movement, which is still in existence today. In the middle of the 1800s, there was a movement towards supporting workers' movements and away from the idea that big plans of how to reorganize society were what was important. Here, the idea was that workers were already mobilized to create unions and fight for the rights within worker organizations, and also to seek the franchise in places where there was already representative government, like in the United States and England. The socialists of the middle of that century were people like Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, but there were others as well, because Marx and Engels were just one among many leading activists who had growing followings, and in fact they were not the foremost at all at that time. But the general idea was, let's help develop the workers' movement and move from organizing workers to extending the franchise to workers to creating working people's parties, socialist parties. So this was the early form of democratic socialism. The plan, the strategy, was to form socialist parties with the workers' movement as the driving force behind it, gain power, and then develop socialism out of that, develop a new form of economy from the needs and the experiences of workers struggling toward that. So do away with the grand plan and come in with the strategy of just getting workers more organized and helping them move forward. That may sound strange to people who think of Karl Marx as somebody who had a master plan and was looking for a violent revolution to institute it, but that's a misunderstanding of Marx, because he was very reticent to talk about what the final form of socialism would actually look like, and his revolutionary instincts were really overturning monarchies and aristocracies where you couldn't do that with the vote. But in places where the vote and representative government were already in place, they were on board with this plan of organizing workers and creating socialist parties to contest for power. Over the course of the end of the 1800s, towards the turn of the century, a number of socialist parties developed in European countries as well as Australia. And in Germany, in fact, by the turn of the century, they had the largest democratic socialist party in the world, and the Social Democrats of Germany, which was the socialist party there, was the largest party in Germany. But they didn't have much power because the scheme of representation, which was set in place in the 1870s, didn't give equal vote to everybody. It was a class-based system. So even though the socialists were able to elect a lot of people, get a lot of votes, had a lot of members, they still were not able to gain power. That changed after World War I. Two things really came out of World War I. One is the Russian Revolution, which is kind of a digression here, but Lenin, like the other Russian revolutionaries, started out as democratic socialists. They saw that the way forward was to create a legislative body, or to take the one that was already existing and give it real power in order to move the revolution forward. It was actually mutiny by soldiers and sailors and then workers joining in that created the revolution. It wasn't any kind of party that tried to implement that. But Lenin was in a difficult place because Russia was not a capitalist country. It was still feudal. They were still at war with Germany, and there was a civil war going on with counter-revolutionary forces. So Lenin, who took power, led it in a different direction, which led to the Russian communist system that we're familiar with now from history. Going back to Germany, though, the outcome of World War I was a revolution there as well, as in 1918. And they created a new constitution that actually gave power to their legislative body. And since the Democratic Socialists, that is the Social Democrats of Germany, were the largest party, they gained power. Now, the problem was they hadn't given much thought to what socialism was supposed to look like after they gained power. And although during the 1920s, when the economy was doing fairly well, they were able to maintain support, in the 1930s with the Great Depression, they were not doing well at all. They lost voters because voters wanted immediate benefits and they were struggling. And the socialists had no big plan for how to manage a capitalist economy, which they still had. They didn't try to institute socialism. They didn't really know what that would look like. There was long debate between doing it gradually or doing it all at once, even though they didn't know all at once towards what. This led to their losing voters and the Nazis taking power, Hitler coming to power, and pretty much was a disaster for that country and for the rest of the world. But an experience out of the Depression was experimentation with ways to actually manage a capitalist economy that served the values that socialists had, like providing for the working people and giving them a little more power in the government, a lot more power in the government, really. And that was what's called Keynesian Theory, which started developing in Sweden, just out of the necessity. The government would spend more to create employment. And in the United States, Franklin Roosevelt saw the value of some of this as well. And especially during World War II, the spending on the military in the United States proved that Keynesian theory could work to revive the economy, ended the Great Depression in the United States. Now, when I say Keynesian, I'm referring to John Maynard Keynes, who was an English economist and a socialist, who developed a theory explaining how these types of actions could actually help manage capitalism better. So after World War II, a number of socialist parties, democratic socialist parties, came to power in different European countries at one time or another, and they were able to use Keynesian policy to manage capitalism, to maintain good levels of employment, and to extend a lot of social welfare benefits to working people. It seemed good for a while, but you ran into the 1970s, there was a major crisis. I should also mention in the 1960s, you had the New Left, which was disillusioned with bureaucracy in general, both the bureaucratic state socialism of the USSR and the bureaucracy surrounding social democratic parties in Europe, and wanted greater individual freedom and a greater say in their life. But the 60s movement toward a new left was crushed by repression in the 1970s. And then there was an economic crisis, which conservatives were successful in attributing to the social welfare state and the spending and the government interference in the economy. What actually happened is very complex, but a key element of it is that after World War II, the United States dominated the world economy, and the US dollar was the primary currency. As other countries began to recover economically, like Germany, France, and Japan, England, they recovered from the war. They began to rebuild their economy. The United States was under stress with more competition. It put the dollar's value under question, and it led to a lot of unemployment. And employers and conservatives in general, who had been trying to find ways to overcome the success of the social welfare state, did an ideological war on those old ideas and said what we need instead is to return to conservative values like less taxes, less government spending, and you know the whole drill. This is neoliberalism. This is the austerity policies of constricting the rights of unions, constricting social welfare spending, reducing taxes, and businesses in a global economy now, because this was really what happened with the revival of European and Japanese economies, was the economy became even more global than it had been in the past. A system of trade that benefited investors over workers, and the movement of capital from places of high wages to places of low wages. The United States lost a lot of jobs in that process, and trade wars that were being exacerbated by international finance. Speculators who saw that any country that tried to revive a social welfare state or the old policies would have pressure on its currency, and speculators would dump that currency and go to other currencies, which put a lot of stress in that country to return to the international order in order to engage in international trade and also get lending from international institutions when they needed it. So this whole regime of neoliberalism started around the 1980s. Parties that had been center-left, social democratic, or in the United States, the Democrats, moved toward the center, the so-called center, which really meant they moved back to raw capitalism, and that's where we've been ever since, up until very recently.